When the storm of World War II swept across Europe, it was the Red Army that stood as the immovable wall against the Nazi tide. Forged in revolution and hardened by the brutal winters of the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union's military force became one of the most formidable in history. From the ashes of early defeats to the triumph at Stalingrad and the final march into Berlin, the Red Army's journey was one of sacrifice, endurance, and unimaginable scale. In today's video, we uncover the story of the Red Army in World War II, the battles, the leaders, and the legacy of the soldiers who helped turn the tide of the deadliest war the world has ever known. The Red Army, formerly known as the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army, emerged from the crucible of the Russian Civil War, 1917–1922. A conflict born out of the Bolshevik Revolution. This revolutionary force was not merely a military entity but a symbol of the ideological fervor that swept through Russia in the wake of the collapse of the Tsarist regime. Created by Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik comrades, the Red Army was envisioned as an instrument of proletarian power, a means to defend the nascent Soviet state against counter-revolutionary forces and foreign interventionists. Unlike traditional armies rooted in aristocratic hierarchies, the Red Army was structured around Marxist principles, emphasizing class solidarity and the collective will of the workers and peasants. The early years of the Red Army were marked by chaos and improvisation, with no formal military tradition to draw upon. The Bolsheviks relied on a combination of political commissars, former Tsarist officers known as military specialists, and raw recruits drawn from the working classes. Leon Trotsky, the fiery orator and people's commissar for military affairs, played a pivotal role in its formation. Under his leadership, the Red Army adopted innovative strategies such as mobile warfare, mass mobilization, and political indoctrination within its ranks. These practices, though controversial, proved effective in defeating the White Army and securing Bolshevik control over much of the former Russian Empire. By the 1930s, under Joseph Stalin's iron grip, the Red Army underwent significant modernization. Industrialization fueled by the five-year plans enabled the Soviet Union to produce vast quantities of tanks, artillery, and aircraft. However, this period was also marred by Stalin's purges, which decimated the officer corps. Thousands of experienced military leaders were executed or imprisoned on charges of espionage or disloyalty, leaving a void in command expertise. Despite these setbacks, the Red Army grew in size and technological capability, preparing for what many saw as an inevitable clash with Nazi Germany. When Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the Red Army faced its greatest challenge yet. The invasion caught Soviet forces off guard, exposing critical weaknesses in leadership, logistics, and coordination. Entire divisions were encircled and annihilated in the opening weeks of the campaign, resulting in staggering losses. Yet, even amidst catastrophe, the Red Army demonstrated remarkable resilience. Its ability to absorb punishment while regrouping and counterattacking would become a defining feature of its performance throughout World War II. As the war progressed, the Red Army evolved into a formidable fighting force, driven by a potent mix of ideology, patriotism, and sheer survival instinct. This transformation set the stage for some of the most dramatic battles in human history, where the fate of Europe, and perhaps the world, would hang precariously in the balance. On the morning of June 22, 1941, the tranquility of the Eastern Front was shattered by the deafening roar of German artillery and the relentless advance of 3 million Axis troops. Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's colossal invasion of the Soviet Union, was the largest military operation in history, involving nearly 4,000 tanks, over 2,000 aircraft, and 75% of the Wehrmacht's total combat strength. For the Red Army, it began as a catastrophic nightmare. Stalin had dismissed intelligence reports warning of an impending attack, clinging to his belief that Hitler wouldn't risk a two-front war. This fatal miscalculation left Soviet defenses unprepared and scattered across vast expanses of territory. The initial stages of Barbarossa showcased the Red Army's severe vulnerabilities. Despite its numerical superiority, Soviet forces were poorly coordinated, inadequately equipped, and hamstrung by the lingering effects of Stalin's purges. Commanders, many of whom were inexperienced replacements promoted during the Great Purge, struggled to respond effectively to the blitzkrieg tactics employed by the Germans. Within days, entire Soviet divisions were encircled and destroyed in massive pockets, such as Bialystok, Minsk, and Smolensk. By mid-July, the Red Army had lost over 1 million soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, and vast amounts of equipment, including thousands of tanks and aircraft. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming defeat, the Red Army displayed extraordinary tenacity. Retreating units engaged in fierce rearguard actions to slow the German advance, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. Civilians joined partisan movements behind enemy lines, sabotaging supply lines and gathering intelligence. Meanwhile, Soviet industry began an unprecedented relocation effort, moving factories eastward beyond the Ural Mountains to ensure continued production of war material. This Herculean logistical feat allowed the Red Army to rebuild its strength while avoiding total collapse. One of the most pivotal moments came during the Battle of Moscow in late 1941. Exhausted German forces pushed to within sight of the Kremlin before being halted by a combination of Soviet counterattacks, harsh winter conditions, and overstretched supply lines. The defense of Moscow marked a turning point. Not only did it prevent the fall of the Soviet capital, but it also shattered the myth of German invincibility. The Red Army's dogged resistance during this period laid the groundwork for future successes, proving that even against seemingly insurmountable odds, they could endure and adapt. As the first months of Barbarossa drew to a close, the Red Army stood battered but unbroken. While the cost in lives and resources had been immense, the lessons learned from these early defeats would shape its evolution into a more disciplined and effective fighting force. The resilience demonstrated during this dark chapter foreshadowed the eventual triumphs that would come at Stalingrad, Kursk, and beyond, a testament to the indomitable spirit of the Soviet people and their army. Perhaps the most iconic battle of the Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad, epitomized the brutal nature of the conflict between the Red Army and Nazi Germany. Beginning in August 1942, the city became a crucible of urban warfare, where the very streets and buildings were contested with ferocious intensity. The Soviets, under the leadership of General Vasily Chuikov, employed a strategy of hugging the enemy, engaging them at close quarters to negate the German advantage in air power and artillery. This tactic, combined with the harsh Russian winter and dwindling supplies, led to a dire situation for the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus. The turning point came in November 1942 when Operation Uranus was launched. This bold Soviet counteroffensive encircled the German forces in Stalingrad, cutting them off from supplies and reinforcements. What followed was one of the most grueling sieges in military history, culminating in the surrender of the remnants of the Sixth Army in February 1943. The victory at Stalingrad not only marked the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht, but also boosted Soviet morale and international prestige, signaling a new phase of the war where the initiative increasingly lay with the Allies. Following the devastation of Stalingrad, the Red Army prepared for another decisive confrontation at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. Known as the largest tank battle in history, Kursk involved over 6,000 armored vehicles and hundreds of thousands of troops. The Germans planned a pincer movement aimed at encircling and destroying the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. However, forewarned by intelligence, the Soviets constructed extensive defensive fortifications, including anti-tank ditches and minefields, designed to absorb and repel the German assault. The battle opened with a massive German offensive, but the well-prepared Soviet defenses inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers. When the Red Army launched its counteroffensive, Operation Kutuzov, they broke through the weakened German lines, forcing a retreat. The failure of the German offensive at Kursk marked the end of their strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, allowing the Soviets to transition to a sustained offensive push westward. While not a battlefield in the conventional sense, the siege of Leningrad represented a prolonged test of endurance and resilience. Lasting from September 1941 to January 1944. The siege saw the city's population endure extreme hardship, starvation, and constant bombardment. Despite these challenges, the Red Army managed to maintain a tenuous supply line across Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life, which prevented the complete collapse of the city. The eventual lifting of the siege in early 1944 was achieved through a combination of Soviet offensives and the weakening of German forces elsewhere on the Eastern Front. The perseverance of the citizens and defenders of Leningrad became a symbol of Soviet determination and unity, significantly impacting the morale of both the military and civilian populations. These battles collectively underscored the evolving capabilities of the Red Army. Each engagement was characterized by meticulous planning, resourceful use of terrain, and an unwavering commitment to victory. As the Red Army gained experience and confidence, it transformed from a struggling defensive force into a formidable offensive juggernaut, setting the stage for the eventual liberation of Eastern Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany. The Red Army's success in World War II cannot be attributed solely to its sheer numbers or resilience. It was equally the result of groundbreaking innovations in weaponry, tactics, and industrial capacity. These advancements not only bolstered the Soviet war effort, but also reshaped the nature of modern warfare. Central to this transformation was the development of highly effective weapon systems, the implementation of novel operational doctrines, and the unparalleled mobilization of Soviet industry, all of which contributed to the Red Army's dominance on the Eastern Front. Few pieces of military hardware have had as profound an impact on warfare as the T-34 medium tank. Introduced in 1940, the T-34 was a marvel of engineering, combining speed, firepower, and rugged reliability in a way that no other tank of the era could match. Equipped with a powerful 76mm gun and sloped armor that deflected enemy shells, the T-34 proved nearly impervious to German anti-tank weapons during the early stages of the war. Its Christie suspension system allowed it to traverse rough terrain with ease, giving Soviet tank crews a mobility advantage over their German counterparts. The T-34's design philosophy emphasized simplicity and mass production, enabling Soviet factories to churn out tens of thousands of units despite the chaos of war. By 1945, over 84,000 T-34s had rolled off assembly lines, forming the backbone of Soviet armored divisions. At the Battle of Kursk, the T-34 played a decisive role in halting the German offensive, demonstrating its superiority in both defensive and offensive operations. The tank's influence extended far beyond World War II, inspiring generations of armored vehicle designs worldwide. While the T-34 provided the Red Army with a material edge, its success was amplified by the adoption of the deep battle doctrine, a revolutionary concept developed by Soviet military theorists in the interwar period. Unlike traditional linear tactics, which focused on frontal assaults and static trench warfare, deep battle emphasized simultaneous attacks across multiple axes to disrupt and destroy the enemy's entire operational structure. This approach sought to exploit breaches in the enemy's front lines, penetrate deep into their rear areas, and target critical supply lines, command centers, and reserves. The doctrine required precise coordination between infantry, artillery, tanks, and air support, all operating as part of a unified whole. During the Battle of Stalingrad, for example, Soviet forces used deep battle principles to encircle and isolate the German Sixth Army, cutting it off from reinforcement and resupply. Similarly, at Kursk, the Red Army employed echeloned defenses followed by deep counterattacks to neutralize the German panzer divisions. Deep battle not only maximized the effectiveness of Soviet forces, but also forced the Wehrmacht to adapt to an entirely new style of warfare, one they were ultimately unable to master. Behind every successful military campaign lies a robust industrial base, and the Soviet Union's wartime economy was nothing short of extraordinary. Under the direction of central planners like Georgy Malenkov and Lazar Kamenevich, the Soviet government implemented a massive relocation program in 1941, moving hundreds of factories eastward beyond the reach of German bombers. Cities like Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, and Novosibirsk became hubs of industrial activity, producing everything from tanks and planes to rifles and ammunition. The scale of Soviet production was staggering. By 1943, Soviet factories were outproducing Germany in nearly every category of military equipment. Over 100,000 aircraft, 90,000 artillery pieces, and 100,000 tanks were manufactured during the war, providing the Red Army with a steady stream of reinforcements. Women and children joined the workforce en masse, ensuring that production quotas were met despite the loss of millions of men to the front lines. This industrial mobilization not only sustained the Red Army, but also gave it the numerical and technological advantage needed to overwhelm the Wehrmacht. In addition to conventional military innovations, the Red Army capitalized on unconventional methods of warfare, particularly guerrilla tactics employed by partisan groups behind enemy lines. Operating in small, decentralized units, Soviet partisans disrupted German supply lines, sabotaged railways, and conducted hit-and-run attacks on isolated garrisons. Estimates suggest that over 300,000 partisans were active in occupied territories, tying down significant German resources and sowing chaos in the rear areas. The effectiveness of partisan warfare was exemplified during the Dnieper River crossings in late 1943, where Soviet irregulars provided critical intelligence and harassed retreating German forces. Combined with the Red Army's conventional advances, these operations created a multi-layered threat that the Wehrmacht struggled to contain. The integration of partisan efforts into broader military strategy underscored the Red Army's ability to innovate and adapt to the demands of total war. Together, these innovations, ranging from the T-34 tank to the deep battle doctrine and industrial mobilization, transformed the Red Army into a formidable fighting force capable of defeating one of history's most powerful militaries. They not only secured victory on the battlefield but also cemented the Soviet Union's status as a global superpower in the post-war era. Amidst the vast machinery of war, individual stories of heroism and sacrifice emerge as poignant reminders of the human cost of conflict. The Red Army was not merely a collective force of soldiers. It was composed of countless individuals whose courage and determination shaped the outcome of battles and the fate of nations. Through the accounts of three remarkable figures, Lyudmila Pavyashenko, the deadliest female sniper in history, Alexei Murasiev, a pilot who defied unimaginable odds, and Ivan Panfilov, a general whose legacy endures in legend, we glimpse the personal dimensions of the Soviet war effort. Lyudmila Pavyashenko's story is one of defiance and resilience. Born in Ukraine in 1916, she was a history student when war broke out. But her academic pursuits were soon overshadowed by the urgency of defending her homeland. Volunteering for the Red Army, Pavyashenko initially faced skepticism due to her gender. However, her sharp-shooting skills quickly silenced doubters. Armed with a Mosin Nagant rifle, she became one of the most feared snipers on the Eastern Front, credited with 309 confirmed kills. Pavyashenko's exploits were not limited to her marksmanship. Her presence on the battlefield inspired fellow soldiers and civilians alike, challenging societal norms about women's roles in warfare. Wounded multiple times and eventually withdrawn from combat duty, she embarked on a diplomatic mission to the United States and Canada, becoming a symbol of Soviet resistance. Her famous retort to a skeptical journalist, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders," underscored her unyielding resolve and earned her widespread admiration. The Alexei Murasiev's tale is one of extraordinary endurance. A fighter pilot in the Soviet Air Force, Murasiev was shot down during a dogfight in April 1942. Severely injured and stranded in enemy territory, he spent 18 days crawling through snow and forests with both legs frostbitten and gangrenous. Despite unimaginable pain, he refused to surrender. Determined to return to his unit, rescued just in time, doctors were forced to amputate his legs below the knee. Remarkably, Murasiev's story did not end there. Fitted with prosthetic limbs, he defied medical expectations by returning to active duty less than a year later. Overcoming physical limitations, he flew 86 combat missions and achieved numerous aerial victories. His indomitable spirit made him a national hero, embodying the Soviet ideal of perseverance against all odds. Murasiev's life after the war included advocacy for disabled veterans, further cementing his legacy as a figure of hope and inspiration. Ivan Panfilov's name is forever etched in Soviet history, thanks to the legendary stand of his 316th Rifle Division near Moscow in November 1941. A seasoned commander from Kazakhstan, Panfilov led his troops with unwavering determination during some of the darkest days of the war. Facing overwhelming odds, his division played a crucial role in slowing the German advance toward the Soviet capital. The most celebrated episode of Panfilov's career is the defense of the Volokholamsk highway by a small group of soldiers known as the Panfilov's 28 Guardsmen. According to Soviet accounts, these men held off waves of German tanks and infantry, sacrificing themselves to protect the road to Moscow. Though historical scrutiny has cast doubt on certain details, the symbolic importance of their stand remains undiminished. Panfilov himself died in action shortly afterward, but his legacy lived on, immortalized in literature, film, and public memory, as a paragon of Soviet patriotism. These stories, while exceptional, are emblematic of the countless acts of bravery performed by ordinary men and women thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Pavlichenko, Maresiev, and Panfilov represent different facets of the Red Army experience. The breaking of gender barriers, the triumph of human will over physical adversity, and the selfless dedication to a greater cause. Their contributions remind us that behind every statistic and strategic victory lies a tapestry woven from individual sacrifices and acts of valor. These heroes, and others like them, ensured that the Red Army's march to victory was not only a triumph of arms but also a testament to the indomitable human spirit. At the heart of the Red Army's organizational structure during World War II lay a unique institution that distinguished it from other military forces of the era: the political commissars. These officers, tasked with ensuring ideological conformity and loyalty within the ranks, played a dual role as both enforcers of communist doctrine and motivators of troop morale. Their presence reflected the Soviet Union's fusion of military and political objectives, where victory on the battlefield was inseparable from the triumph of socialist ideals. Political commissars were first introduced during the Russian Civil War as a means of maintaining discipline and fostering revolutionary zeal among soldiers. By the time World War II erupted, their role had evolved but remained fundamentally tied to the preservation of the Soviet state's ideological integrity. Commissars operated alongside military commanders, reviewing orders, monitoring troop behavior, and delivering propaganda aimed at reinforcing the connection between individual sacrifice and the collective struggle against fascism. Every decision, from tactical maneuvers to supply distribution, was scrutinized through the lens of Marxist-Leninist principles. The commissar system reached its zenith during the war, with officers embedded at every level of command from divisions down to platoons. Their authority was often equal to or greater than that of military leaders, creating a complex dynamic where operational decisions required ideological approval. This arrangement sometimes led to friction, as pragmatic military considerations clashed with rigid ideological imperatives. Nevertheless, the presence of commissars ensured that the Red Army remained a tool not only of national defense but also of ideological propagation. Beyond their ideological duties, political commissars served as vital conduits for maintaining morale in the face of staggering losses and relentless adversity. They organized cultural events, distributed letters from home, and delivered speeches extolling the heroism of Soviet soldiers. In moments of crisis, commissars often took direct command of units, rallying troops with impassioned appeals to their patriotism and sense of duty. Their ability to inspire resilience became especially crucial during the darkest hours of the war, such as the encirclements of 1941 and the brutal urban combat of Stalingrad. For many soldiers, commissars embodied the ideals of the Soviet state, offering a sense of purpose amid the chaos of war. Stories abound of commissars leading charges, sharing hardships with their men, and even sacrificing themselves to save their units. Such acts reinforced the notion that the fight against Nazi Germany was not merely a military campaign but a moral crusade for the survival of humanity itself. This narrative helped sustain the Red Army through periods of extreme duress, transforming despair into determination. Despite their contributions, the commissar system was not without controversy. Critics argued that the dual command structure hindered efficiency, particularly in fast-moving combat situations where split-second decisions were critical. Moreover, the purges of the 1930s had instilled a culture of fear within the officer corps, and some commissars exacerbated tensions by accusing competent commanders of disloyalty. Instances of abuse and overreach tarnished the reputation of the institution, leading to calls for reform. Recognizing these shortcomings, Stalin issued Order No. 30 in July 1942, which reduced the authority of political officers and restored sole command to military leaders, while commissars retained their roles in ideological education and morale building. Their diminished oversight marked a pragmatic shift toward improving battlefield effectiveness. This adaptation underscored the Red Army's capacity to evolve, balancing ideological purity with the practical demands of modern warfare. The legacy of political commissars extends beyond their wartime contributions. They exemplified the Soviet Union's unique approach to integrating politics and military affairs, ensuring that the Red Army remained a bastion of communist ideology even in the heat of battle. Their efforts to galvanize troops and uphold the state's values played a central role in sustaining the Soviet war effort. While the system was imperfect and often fraught with tension, its ability to inspire loyalty and resilience underscores the profound interplay between ideology and military success in the context of World War II. In the annals of history, the political commissars stand as both guardians and symbols of the Red Army's dual mission, to defend the motherland and to advance the cause of socialism. Their story is one of complexity and contradiction, reflecting the broader tensions and triumphs of the Soviet experience during the most destructive conflict in human history. The Eastern Front of World War II bore witness to some of the most devastating human suffering ever recorded, with the Red Army and the Soviet civilian population enduring losses on an almost incomprehensible scale. The sheer magnitude of death and destruction inflicted during the conflict underscores the brutal reality of total war, where the boundaries between combatants and non-combatants blurred, and survival itself became an act of defiance. To fully comprehend the Red Army's achievements, one must reckon with the staggering price paid in human lives, psychological trauma, and the long-term scars left on Soviet society. The Red Army suffered astronomical losses throughout the war, with estimates placing total military fatalities at approximately 7 million soldiers. These figures include those killed in action, missing in action, and succumbing to wounds or disease. The scale of these losses can be partially attributed to the ferocity of the fighting on the Eastern Front, where battles often devolved into merciless attrition. For instance, During the Battle of Stalingrad alone, Soviet forces incurred over 1.1 million casualties, a number that eclipses the combined losses of many Western campaigns. The high casualty rates were exacerbated by several factors, including the initial unpreparedness of Soviet forces at the outset of Operation Barbarossa, the purges of experienced officers in the 1930s, and the Wehrmacht's superior tactics and technology in the early years of the war. Additionally, the Soviet strategy of trading space for time, retreating deeper into the vast expanse of the USSR while drawing the Germans into protracted engagements, often resulted in heavy losses as units fought desperate rearguard actions. Despite these challenges, the Red Army's ability to replenish its ranks through mass conscription and industrial mobilization ensured that it could continue to field large armies, even as casualty lists grew longer. While the Red Army bore the brunt of military casualties, the civilian population endured horrors that rivaled those faced by soldiers. An estimated 16–20 million Soviet civilians perished during the war, victims of starvation, forced labor, massacres, and deliberate policies of extermination carried out by Nazi occupation forces. Entire regions were depopulated as cities burned, villages were razed, and millions were displaced. The siege of Leningrad stands as one of the most harrowing examples, where over 1 million civilians died from starvation, cold, and bombardment over the course of nearly 900 days. Particularly devastating was the Holocaust on Soviet soil, where Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, systematically murdered Jews, Romani people, and other targeted groups. The sieges in Letsakim Grim landbarracks across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, bearing silent testimony to the genocide that unfolded. Yet, even amidst such atrocities, acts of resistance emerged. Soviet partisans, often civilians turned fighters, waged guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines, sabotaging supply lines, rescuing prisoners, and assassinating collaborators. Their efforts not only inflicted damage on the occupiers but also provided a semblance of hope to oppressed populations. Beyond the immediate toll in lives, the war left deep psychological wounds that reverberated across generations. Soldiers returning from the front lines often grappled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Though mental health issues were rarely acknowledged or treated in the Soviet Union, many veterans struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, haunted by memories of comrades lost, atrocities witnessed, and the relentless brutality of combat. Families torn apart by the war faced the added burden of raising children without fathers or husbands, further straining already fragile social structures. The demographic consequences of the war were equally profound. Entire cohorts of young men were wiped out, leaving a gaping void in the workforce and contributing to a significant gender imbalance in post-war Soviet society. Women, who had stepped into roles traditionally held by men during the conflict, found themselves shouldering dual responsibilities as breadwinners and caregivers. The war's economic devastation compounded these challenges, as rebuilding efforts strained resources and delayed recovery. The human cost of the war irrevocably transformed the Soviet Union, shaping its identity and influencing its trajectory in the decades that followed. The shared experience of sacrifice fostered a sense of unity and pride among survivors, reinforcing the narrative of the Great Patriotic War as a defining moment in Soviet history. Monuments, museums, and annual commemorations served as reminders of the collective struggle, while veterans were celebrated as heroes who had saved the nation from annihilation. However, this narrative of triumph masked the underlying fragility of Soviet society. The war had exposed the vulnerabilities of the Stalinist system, from its reliance on coercion to its inability to adequately prepare for the conflict. While the Red Army's ultimate victory solidified the USSR's status as a global superpower, the scars of the war lingered, manifesting in persistent shortages, environmental degradation, and a population forever marked by the horrors they had endured. In this sense, the human cost of the war was not merely a statistical abstraction, but a lived reality that defined the Soviet experience for generations to come. Throughout World War II, the Red Army underwent a profound transformation in its military strategies, evolving from a beleaguered defensive force into a sophisticated offensive juggernaut. This evolution was driven by a combination of hard-won battlefield experience, innovative thinking, and the relentless pursuit of adaptability in the face of an ever-changing conflict. Key elements of this strategic progression included the development of flexible logistics networks, the refinement of combined arms operations, and the mastery of deception tactics, each playing a critical role in the Red Army's eventual dominance on the Eastern Front. One of the most significant challenges facing the Red Army at the onset of Operation Barbarossa was its logistical vulnerability. The rapid German advance disrupted Soviet supply lines, leaving frontline units without adequate ammunition, fuel, or food. Recognizing this weakness, Soviet commanders placed an unprecedented emphasis on building resilient and adaptable logistical systems. By relocating key industries eastward beyond the Urals, the USSR ensured a steady flow of war material even as vast swaths of territory fell to the Wehrmacht. Factories churned out tanks, artillery, and aircraft at an astonishing rate, while railroads and truck convoys worked tirelessly to deliver supplies to the front lines. The logistical improvements extended beyond mere production. The Red Army pioneered the use of mobile repair units, which could rapidly mend damaged vehicles and return them to service. This innovation drastically increased the operational readiness of Soviet forces, particularly during prolonged offensives where maintaining momentum was crucial. Additionally, the establishment of forward supply depots allowed units to operate independently for extended periods, reducing their reliance on vulnerable rear area supply lines. These adaptations not only addressed early deficiencies but also provided the Red Army with the logistical flexibility necessary to execute large-scale operations across vast distances. Another cornerstone of the Red Army's strategic evolution was the refinement of combined arms tactics, which integrated infantry, armor, artillery, and air support into cohesive, operational units. Early in the war, Soviet forces often struggled to coordinate these elements effectively, leading to disjointed attacks and high casualties. However, lessons learned from engagements like the Battle of Moscow and the Battle of Stalingrad prompted a shift toward more integrated approaches. The concept of deep battle, developed in the interwar period, became the guiding principle for Soviet combined arms operations. This doctrine emphasized simultaneous strikes along multiple axes, targeting not only the enemy's frontline troops but also their reserves, command centers, and supply lines. Tanks spearheaded breakthroughs, supported by artillery barrages and close air support, while infantry consolidated gains and expanded the breach. The Battle of Kursk exemplified this approach, where Soviet forces employed layered defenses to absorb the initial German assault before launching a devastating counterattack that exploited gaps in the enemy's lines. The success of combined arms operations hinged on rigorous training and clear communication between units. Commanders like Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Konstantin Rokossovsky excelled in orchestrating these complex maneuvers, ensuring that every component of the Red Army worked in harmony. By the later stages of the war, the synergy achieved through combined arms had become a hallmark of Soviet military prowess, enabling them to outmaneuver and overwhelm even the most experienced German divisions. Deception played a pivotal role in the Red Army's strategic arsenal, with Masirovka, the art of military deception, becoming a defining feature of Soviet operations. Drawing on centuries-old traditions of cunning and subterfuge, Soviet planners employed elaborate ruses to mislead their opponents, creating opportunities for surprise attacks and reducing the effectiveness of enemy responses. From false radio transmissions to dummy tanks and fake troop concentrations, the Red Army mastered the art of projecting misleading information to confuse and destabilize the Wehrmacht. One of the most famous examples of Masirovka occurred during Operation Bagration in 1944, a massive Soviet offensive aimed at liberating Belarus. Prior to the attack, Soviet forces concealed their true intentions through a combination of feints, misinformation, and careful camouflage. Entire armies were hidden in dense forests, while decoy equipment misled German reconnaissance into believing that the main thrust would occur elsewhere. When the offensive commenced, the Germans were caught completely off guard, suffering catastrophic losses as the Red Army surged forward with overwhelming force. Masirovka was not limited to grand strategic operations. It also proved invaluable at the tactical level. Small unit commanders frequently employed ambushes, diversions, and nighttime maneuvers to outwit numerically superior foes. The psychological impact of these deceptions compounded their practical benefits, sowing confusion and eroding enemy morale. By the final years of the war, the Red Army's proficiency in deception had become so advanced that even veteran German commanders found themselves consistently outfoxed. The Red Army's strategic evolution during World War II stands as a testament to its remarkable adaptability. Faced with immense challenges, Soviet commanders embraced innovation, learning from their mistakes and refining their methods with each successive campaign. The development of flexible logistics, the mastery of combined arms, and the widespread use of deception tactics collectively transformed the Red Army into a force capable of executing some of the most ambitious and successful military operations in history. This evolution not only secured victory on the Eastern Front but also cemented the Red Army's reputation as one of the most formidable fighting forces of the 20th century. As the tide of World War II turned decisively in favor of the Allies, the Red Army embarked on a monumental campaign to drive Nazi forces out of Eastern Europe. This offensive, spanning from the frozen steppes of the Soviet Union to the heart of Berlin, was not merely a military endeavor but a geopolitical revolution that reshaped the map of Europe. The liberation of occupied territories brought with it a complex interplay of hope, vengeance, and ideological imposition, as the Soviet Union sought to consolidate its influence over the region. The Red Army's advance was marked by both heroic feats of liberation and controversial acts that left lasting scars on the societies it touched. The Red Army's westward march began in earnest in 1944. Following the catastrophic German defeat at the Battle of Kursk. Operation Bagration, launched in June of that year, was a masterstroke of Soviet strategy, targeting the German Army Group Center in Belarus. Within weeks, the operation obliterated the Wehrmacht's presence in the region, liberating cities like Minsk and Vilnius and pushing the front lines hundreds of kilometers westward. For the first time since the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Red Army stood poised to reclaim lost ground and extend its reach into Eastern Europe. Poland, a nation devastated by years of occupation, became the next focal point of the Soviet advance. The liberation of Warsaw, however, was marred by tragedy. The Warsaw Uprising of August 1944, a valiant but ultimately doomed attempt by Polish resistance fighters to seize control of the city, ended in catastrophe as the Red Army halted its advance on the eastern banks of the Vistula River. While Soviet propagandists claimed logistical constraints, many historians argue that Stalin deliberately allowed the uprising to fail, viewing the Polish Home Army as a rival to Soviet-backed communist factions. By the time Warsaw was finally liberated in January 1945, much of the city lay in ruins, and tens of thousands of civilians had perished. Further south, the Red Army's entry into the Balkans brought liberation to nations like Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Hungary, but also ignited new conflicts and tensions. In Romania, the Soviet occupation was accompanied by the installation of a pro-Soviet government, marking the beginning of decades of communist rule. Similar transformations occurred in Bulgaria and Hungary, where local communist parties, often marginalized before the war, gained prominence under Soviet patronage. Yugoslavia presented a unique case, as Josip Broz Tito's partisans had already established significant control over much of the country. While the Red Army cooperated with Tito's forces to expel German troops, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Stalin viewed Tito's independent streak with suspicion, laying the groundwork for the eventual rupture between Yugoslavia and the Soviet bloc in the post-war years. Despite these complexities, the liberation of the Balkans was celebrated by many as the end of Nazi tyranny, even if it heralded the onset of Soviet hegemony. The Red Army's advance was not without its darker aspects. In the wake of Nazi atrocities, Soviet soldiers often exacted brutal revenge against German civilians and perceived collaborators. Accounts of looting, rape, and summary executions became tragically commonplace, particularly in East Prussia and parts of Germany. While such acts were officially condemned by Soviet authorities, the sheer scale of the violence suggested a breakdown in discipline and a desire for retribution after years of suffering. The treatment of ethnic Germans living in Eastern Europe further underscored the complexities of liberation. Millions were forcibly expelled from their homes in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other countries, often with tacit Soviet approval. These mass deportations, justified as retribution for Nazi crimes, resulted in immense human suffering and remain a contentious chapter in European history. For many, the liberation brought by the Red Army was intertwined with displacement, loss, and trauma. The culmination of the Red Army's march across Eastern Europe came with the capture of Berlin in April-May 1945. A campaign that symbolized both the triumph of Soviet military might and the collapse of Nazi Germany. The Battle of Berlin was one of the most intense and symbolic engagements of World War II, as it marked the final stand of Adolf Hitler's regime and the end of the Third Reich. For the Red Army, the assault on Berlin was not merely a military objective, but also a deeply personal mission to avenge the devastation inflicted upon the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa. The battle for Berlin began in mid-April 1945, with 3 Soviet fronts, commanded by Marshals Georgy Zhukov, Ivan Konov, and Konstantin Rokossovsky, converging on the German capital from multiple directions. The operation involved over 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 40,000 artillery pieces, making it one of the largest urban assaults in history. Berlin, already battered by Allied bombing campaigns, became a fortress of desperation as remnants of the Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS, and Volkssturm militia prepared to defend the city to the last man. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, characterized by fierce street-to-street combat and house-to-house skirmishes. Soviet forces employed overwhelming firepower, using heavy artillery and Katyusha rocket launchers to soften enemy positions before advancing. Tanks navigated the rubble-strewn streets, while infantry units cleared buildings room by room. Despite their numerical inferiority, German defenders put up a tenacious resistance, inflicting heavy casualties on the attackers. However, the sheer weight of Soviet numbers and firepower eventually overwhelmed them. One of the most iconic moments of the battle occurred on April 30, when Soviet troops raised the hammer and sickle flag atop the Reichstag building. This act, immortalized in photographs and propaganda, became a powerful symbol of Soviet victory and the downfall of Nazi Germany. Although sporadic fighting continued for several days, the capture of the Reichstag effectively sealed the fate of Berlin. On May 2, General Helmuth Weidling, the commander of the city's defense, surrendered unconditionally to Soviet forces. While the fall of Berlin was celebrated as a decisive moment in the defeat of fascism, it also raised profound questions about the nature of liberation. For many Berliners, the arrival of the Red Army was accompanied by terror and despair. Reports of widespread looting, sexual violence, and summary executions cast a shadow over the victory. Historical estimates suggest that tens of thousands of women were raped during the battle, with some sources placing the number as high as 100,000. While Soviet authorities sought to downplay these atrocities, they remain an indelible part of the city's wartime memory. At the same time, the occupation of Berlin represented the beginning of a new era for Europe. The division of the city into Soviet, American, British, and French sectors foreshadowed the geopolitical fault lines that would define the Cold War. For the Soviet Union, the capture of Berlin was both a vindication of its immense sacrifices and a strategic coup, securing a foothold in the heart of Europe. The city became a stage for the ideological struggle between East and West, setting the stage for decades of tension and rivalry. The Battle of Berlin came at an immense cost. Estimates of Soviet casualties during the operation range from 80,000 to over 300,000 dead, wounded, or missing. These losses underscored the ferocity of the fighting and the determination of both sides to prevail. For the Red Army, the victory was bittersweet, as it represented the culmination of years of sacrifice and suffering. Soldiers who had marched all the way from Stalingrad to Berlin bore witness to the destruction wrought by war, even as they celebrated their hard-won triumph. The fall of Berlin also marked the end of Adolf Hitler's reign of terror. On April 30, 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath the city, leaving behind a shattered empire and a world forever changed by his genocidal ambitions. His death signaled the collapse of the Nazi state, though pockets of resistance continued to fight until Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, known as Victory in Europe, The capture of Berlin stands as one of the defining moments of World War II. encapsulating the themes of heroism, brutality, and historical transformation that characterized the conflict. For the Red Army, it was the ultimate vindication of its resilience and determination, a testament to the millions of lives lost in the struggle against fascism. Yet, it also highlighted the complexities of liberation, where the line between deliverance and domination often blurred. As the guns fell silent in Berlin, the world braced itself for the challenges of peace and the dawn of a new geopolitical order shaped by the victors of the war. Behind every soldier marching to the front lines and every tank rolling across the Eastern Front lay the extraordinary efforts of the Soviet Home Front, a collective endeavor that transformed the nation into a vast war machine. The mobilization of civilians, resources, and industry during World War II was unparalleled in scope and intensity, reflecting the Soviet Union's commitment to total war. From factory workers laboring under grueling conditions, to children collecting scrap metal, every segment of society contributed to the war effort. This chapter explores how the Soviet Union harnessed its human and material resources to sustain the Red Army, examining both the remarkable achievements and the immense hardships endured by those left behind. One of the most remarkable accomplishments of the Soviet Home Front was the relocation of entire industries eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. In the face of the German blitzkrieg, which threatened to overrun key industrial centers, the Soviet government undertook an unprecedented evacuation program. Between July and December 1941, over 500 factories ranging from munitions plants to steel mills were dismantled, transported, and reassembled in remote locations such as Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, and Novosibirsk. This mass migration of machinery and personnel ensured that critical production could continue, even as vast swathes of Western Russia fell to the enemy. The relocation effort was fraught with challenges. Factories had to be disassembled piece by piece, loaded onto trains, and transported thousands of miles across a country ravaged by war. Workers, many of whom were women and teenagers, endured harsh living conditions in hastily constructed settlements near the new industrial sites. Despite these difficulties, Soviet industry achieved staggering levels of output. By 1943, the USSR was outproducing Germany in nearly every category of military equipment, including tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The T-34 tank, produced en masse in cities like Nizhny Tagil, exemplified the success of this industrial mobilization, becoming a symbol of Soviet resilience and ingenuity. With millions of men conscripted into the Red Army, women and children emerged as the backbone of the Soviet economy and society. Women made up nearly half of the industrial workforce by 1943, taking on roles traditionally reserved for men in factories, farms, and transportation networks. They operated machinery, assembled weapons, and mined coal, often working double shifts to meet production quotas. Their contributions were indispensable, yet they faced immense physical and emotional strain, balancing demanding jobs with the responsibilities of caring for families amidst food shortages and bombings. Children also played a vital role in supporting the war effort. Schools organized campaigns to collect scrap metal, paper, and other materials for recycling into war supplies. Youngsters participated in agricultural work, helping to harvest crops and maintain collective farms. In urban areas, children served as air raid wardens, assisting in civil defense measures and providing aid to victims of German airstrikes. While their involvement was driven by necessity, it instilled a sense of purpose and patriotism among the younger generation, fostering a shared commitment to victory. The agricultural sector faced immense pressure to feed both the civilian population and the Red Army. The loss of fertile lands in Ukraine and other Western regions to German occupation severely disrupted food production. To compensate, the Soviet government implemented policies aimed at maximizing agricultural output. Collective farms intensified cultivation efforts, employing innovative techniques such as crop rotation and mechanized farming where possible. Peasants worked tirelessly to meet grain quotas, knowing that failure could result in severe penalties. Despite these efforts, food shortages plagued the home front throughout the war. Rationing systems were introduced to allocate scarce resources, prioritizing soldiers and industrial workers. Civilians often subsisted on meager diets, relying on bread, potatoes, and whatever vegetables they could grow in private plots. In besieged cities like Leningrad, starvation claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, highlighting the dire consequences of supply line disruptions. Nevertheless, the resilience of Soviet farmers ensured that the Red Army remained relatively well-fed, sustaining its ability to wage prolonged campaigns. Propaganda played a crucial role in maintaining morale on the home front, reinforcing the narrative of the Great Patriotic War as a righteous struggle against fascism. Posters, films, radio broadcasts, and newspapers extolled the heroism of soldiers and workers, urging citizens to redouble their efforts in support of the war effort. Icons such as the Motherland Calls poster and songs like Kyusha became rallying cries, uniting the population around a common cause. The Soviet government also leveraged cultural initiatives to boost spirit. Mobile theaters traveled to factories and villages, performing plays and concerts for weary workers. Writers and artists produced works glorifying the sacrifices of ordinary people, creating a sense of pride and solidarity. Political officers stationed in workplaces delivered speeches emphasizing the importance of individual contributions to the collective victory, while propaganda sometimes glossed over the realities of war. It provided a psychological lifeline for a population grappling with unimaginable hardships. Beyond formal economic and industrial mobilization, the Soviet home front witnessed the rise of partisan movements in occupied territories. Civilians who refused to submit to German rule formed guerrilla groups, waging a relentless campaign of sabotage and harassment behind enemy lines. Partisans destroyed railways, ambushed convoys, and assassinated collaborators, tying down significant German resources and sowing chaos in rear areas. The effectiveness of the partisan movement varied by region, with Belarus emerging as a stronghold of resistance. Over 300,000 partisans operated in the Republic, supported by local populations and supplied by airdrops from Soviet planes. Their actions not only disrupted German operations but also inspired hope among oppressed civilians, demonstrating that the spirit of defiance remained alive even under occupation. However, collaboration with the enemy also occurred in some areas, driven by coercion or opportunism. The complex interplay of resistance and complicity added another layer to the story of the Soviet home front, underscoring the moral ambiguities of war. The mobilization of the Soviet home front stands as a testament to the extraordinary capacity of a society to endure and adapt in the face of existential threat. Through industrial relocation, the tireless efforts of women and children, agricultural resilience, and the power of ideology, The Soviet Union sustained the Red Army's march toward victory. Yet, this achievement came at an enormous cost, with millions enduring hunger, exhaustion, and loss. The home front's story is one of unity and sacrifice, reminding us that the outcome of World War II was shaped not only by battles fought on distant fields, but also by the quiet heroism of those who labored behind the scenes. By early 1945, the Red Army stood poised to deliver the final blow to Nazi Germany, having reclaimed vast swaths of Soviet territory and pushed deep into Eastern Europe. The momentum gained from victories at Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin positioned the Soviet forces as the dominant military power on the continent, ready to breach the borders of the Third Reich itself. This phase of the war saw the Red Army executing meticulously planned offensives, overcoming formidable defensive fortifications, and confronting the entrenched fanaticism of the Wehrmacht and SS units, determined to hold the line. The advance into Germany was not merely a military operation, but a symbolic reckoning. As the Red Army sought to punish the architects of Operation Barbarossa and liberate millions of enslaved peoples, the Red Army's entry into Germany began with the Vistula Oder offensive in January 1945. A massive operation that propelled Soviet forces from the eastern bank of the Vistula River in Poland to within striking distance of Berlin. Spearheaded by Marshals Zhukov and Konev, the offensive demonstrated the full potential of Soviet combined arms tactics. Armored spearheads, supported by overwhelming artillery barrages and close air support, shattered German defenses and created corridors for infantry to exploit. Within weeks, the Red Army had advanced over 300 kilometers, capturing key cities such as Poznań and Breslau. However, the path to Berlin was blocked by the Siegfried Line, a series of fortified bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and minefields designed to halt any invasion of Germany. Breaching this formidable barrier required careful planning and coordination. Soviet engineers played a critical role, constructing pontoon bridges to cross rivers and clearing minefields to allow armored columns to advance. Artillery units softened enemy positions, while reconnaissance teams identified weak points in the German defenses. The combination of brute force and tactical ingenuity enabled the Red Army to punch through the Siegfried Line, setting the stage for the final assault on Berlin. As the Red Army advanced deeper into Germany, urban warfare became a defining feature of the campaign. Cities like Königsberg, Dresden, and Frankfurt am Main turned into battlegrounds, with Soviet forces employing lessons learned from earlier engagements like Stalingrad. Urban environments presented unique challenges, as narrow streets and dense buildings favored defenders. German troops, often composed of fanatical SS units and inexperienced Volkssturm militia, fought bitterly to delay the Soviet advance, transforming every block and building into a potential stronghold. In Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia, the Red Army launched a concentrated assault in April 1945. The city's medieval fortifications and modern bunkers made it a daunting target, but Soviet commanders adapted their tactics accordingly. Infantry units infiltrated the city under cover of darkness, bypassing heavily defended areas and isolating pockets of resistance. Tanks provided mobile fire support, while artillery pounded key strongpoints. After 4 days of intense fighting, Königsberg fell, marking the first major German city to be captured by the Red Army. Dresden, renowned for its cultural heritage, became another focal point of the campaign. The city had been devastated by Allied bombing raids in February 1945, leaving much of it in ruins. When Soviet forces entered in April, they encountered a ghostly landscape of collapsed buildings and displaced civilians. Despite the devastation, German garrisons mounted a spirited defense, forcing the Red Army to engage in costly street-by-street fighting. The liberation of Dresden underscored the broader humanitarian catastrophe unfolding across Germany, as civilians bore the brunt of both aerial bombardment and ground combat. The final months of the war witnessed a surge in fanaticism among German forces, fueled by Nazi propaganda that portrayed the Red Army as barbaric invaders intent on destroying the German people. Units of the Waffen-SS and Hitler Youth fought with suicidal determination, often refusing to surrender even when surrounded. This unwavering resistance exacted a heavy toll on Soviet forces, prolonging battles and increasing casualties. One particularly harrowing example occurred during the Battle of Halbe in late April 1945. Here, remnants of the German Ninth Army attempted to break through Soviet encirclement in a desperate bid to reach Berlin. What followed was a chaotic melee of tank duels, hand-to-hand combat, and mass surrenders. Soviet troops, exhausted but resolute, systematically dismantled the German breakout attempt, capturing or killing tens of thousands of soldiers. The battle highlighted the grim reality of the war's closing stages, where the distinction between combatant and non-combatant often dissolved in the chaos of retreat. Amid the destruction and bloodshed, the Red Army uncovered evidence of the Holocaust's horrors as it liberated concentration camps scattered across eastern Germany and Poland. Auschwitz, Majdanek, and Sachsenhausen revealed scenes of unimaginable suffering, with emaciated survivors clinging to life amidst piles of corpses. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had endured years of hardship themselves, were profoundly shaken by what they witnessed. Journalists accompanying the Red Army documented the atrocities, ensuring that the world would know the full extent of Nazi crimes. The liberation of these camps added a moral dimension to the Red Army's advance, transforming it into a crusade for justice, as well as victory. Survivors greeted their liberators with gratitude, though the trauma of their experiences left deep scars. For many Soviet soldiers, the discovery of the camps reinforced their resolve to crush the Nazi regime once and for all. The Red Army's advance into Germany culminated in the fall of Berlin and the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany on May 8, 1945. This triumph was tempered by the immense cost in lives and the ethical dilemmas posed by the conduct of Soviet troops in occupied territories. Acts of revenge against German civilians, including widespread looting and sexual violence, cast a shadow over the victory, complicating the narrative of liberation. Nevertheless, the Red Army's march into the heart of the Third Reich remains one of the most significant achievements of World War II. It not only secured the defeat of Nazi Germany but also reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe, paving the way for the emergence of the Soviet Union as a global superpower. The final push into Germany encapsulated the Red Army's evolution from a beleaguered defensive force to a juggernaut, capable of delivering decisive blows against the most formidable foe of the 20th century. The conclusion of World War II marked not only the cessation of hostilities, but also the beginning of an immense reconstruction effort across the devastated landscapes of Europe and Asia. For the Red Army, its role extended far beyond the battlefield. It transitioned from a war machine to a stabilizing force tasked with rebuilding nations and restoring order. This dual responsibility placed the Red Army at the center of post-war recovery efforts, shaping the political, social, and economic trajectories of the territories it occupied. While the immediate aftermath of the war brought relief and liberation to millions, it also set the stage for the geopolitical tensions of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union sought to consolidate its influence over Eastern Europe and beyond. In the wake of the war, the Red Army assumed administrative control over vast territories, including Eastern Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Soviet military governors established provisional governments, often installing communist-leaning leaders aligned with Moscow's interests. His administrations were tasked with maintaining law and order, disarming former Axis collaborators, and initiating basic infrastructure repairs. The presence of Red Army troops ensured compliance with Soviet directives, creating a de facto sphere of influence that would later solidify into the Eastern Bloc. The enforcement of stability, however, was not without controversy. In some regions, Soviet forces suppressed nationalist movements and opposition groups deemed hostile to communist ideals. For instance, in Poland, the Soviet-backed Lublin Committee marginalized the Polish government in exile, leading to accusations of Soviet imperialism. Similarly, in Hungary and Romania, Soviet authorities dismantled pre-war elites and redistributed land to peasants, aligning these societies with Marxist-Leninist principles. While these measures were framed as progressive reforms, they often alienated segments of the population and sowed resentment that would simmer for decades. Reconstruction efforts focused heavily on reviving war-torn economies, with the Red Army playing a pivotal role in facilitating this process. Soviet engineers and technicians collaborated with local labor forces to rebuild roads, bridges, railways, and factories. In many cases, equipment and raw materials confiscated from defeated Axis powers were repurposed for reconstruction projects. For example, machinery seized from German industrial plants was transported to the Soviet Union or redistributed among satellite states to jumpstart production. The Marshall Plan, proposed by the United States in 1947, offered an alternative vision of economic recovery based on capitalism and free markets. However, Soviet-controlled territories rejected this aid, viewing it as a tool of Western influence. Instead, the Soviet Union promoted the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance (COMCON), an organization designed to foster economic cooperation among socialist states. While COMCON facilitated trade and investment, its centralized model often stifled innovation and perpetuated inefficiencies, leaving many Eastern European economies lagging behind their Western counterparts. The Red Army's presence also catalyzed profound social changes in the territories it occupied. Communist ideology emphasized equality, education, and the empowerment of workers, leading to sweeping reforms in areas such as healthcare, education, and labor rights. Women, who had played vital roles during the war, gained greater access to employment and political participation. Although patriarchal attitudes persisted in practice, youth organizations, modeled after Soviet pioneers, were established to indoctrinate the next generation with socialist values. Cultural integration became another priority, as the Soviet Union sought to forge a unified bloc united by shared ideals. Russian language and culture were promoted in schools and media, while local traditions were often suppressed or co-opted to fit the communist narrative. This policy of Russification sparked resistance in some regions, particularly in the Baltic states and Ukraine, where national identities clashed with Soviet homogenization efforts. Nevertheless, the Red Army's role in disseminating Soviet culture helped cement the USSR's dominance over its satellites. While the Red Army's post-war activities laid the foundation for recovery, they also planted the seeds of future conflict. The division of Germany into Soviet and Western zones of occupation epitomized the growing rift between the Allies. Berlin, situated deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany, became a flashpoint for Cold War tensions, culminating in crises such as the Berlin blockade in 1948-1949, and the eventual construction of the Berlin Wall 1961. The Red Army's continued presence in Eastern Europe served as both a guarantor of Soviet hegemony and a source of friction with NATO-aligned nations. Moreover, the Soviet Union's insistence on maintaining buffer states along its western frontier alienated many Europeans who yearned for self-determination. The imposition of communist regimes through rigged elections and military interventions eroded trust in the Soviet system, fueling dissent that would erupt in events like the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and the Prague Spring of 1968. Thus, the Red Army's legacy in post-war Europe was one of paradox. It brought stability and progress to some, while suppressing freedoms and aspirations for others. The Red Army's contributions to post-war reconstruction cannot be understated. Its efforts to restore infrastructure, revive economies, and promote social reforms helped transform devastated societies into functioning states. At the same time, its role as an instrument of Soviet expansionism sowed the seeds of division that defined the Cold War era. The Red Army's dual legacy, both constructive and coercive, reflects the complexities of its mission in a world grappling with the aftermath of unprecedented destruction. As history unfolded, the choices made during this critical period continued to shape the destinies of nations and the course of international relations for generations to come. The story of the Red Army during World War II is one of unparalleled heroism, monumental sacrifice, and profound complexity. It is a narrative that transcends the boundaries of military history, offering timeless lessons about resilience, leadership, and the human condition. At its core, the Red Army's journey, from the catastrophic early defeats of Operation Barbarossa to the triumphant march into Berlin, reveals the extraordinary capacity of individuals and societies to endure and adapt in the face of overwhelming adversity. Yet, it also underscores the moral ambiguities inherent in total war, where acts of valor coexist with instances of brutality, and the pursuit of victory often comes at a devastating cost. The Red Army's ability to rebound from seemingly insurmountable setbacks stands as a testament to human resilience. When Operation Barbarossa caught Soviet forces unprepared, resulting in millions of casualties and the loss of vast territories, the prospect of survival seemed bleak. Yet, the Red Army regrouped, adapted, and ultimately prevailed, driven by an unyielding determination to protect the homeland. This resilience was not merely a matter of strategy or logistics. It was rooted in the collective will of soldiers and civilians alike, who drew strength from their shared identity and purpose. The defense of Moscow, the counter-offensive at Stalingrad, and the relentless push westward exemplify the transformative power of perseverance when coupled with clear objectives and unwavering resolve. This lesson resonates far beyond the context of war. In any domain, whether personal, professional, or societal, the capacity to endure hardship and learn from failure can unlock untapped potential. The Red Army's experience reminds us that setbacks are not endpoints, but opportunities for growth, provided we possess the courage to confront them head-on. Another enduring insight from the Red Army's story is the critical importance of leadership and adaptability. The early years of the war exposed glaring deficiencies in Soviet command structures, exacerbated by Stalin's purges and rigid ideological constraints. However, as the conflict progressed, leaders like Georgy Zhukov, Ivan Konev, and Konstantin Rokossovsky demonstrated remarkable flexibility, embracing innovative tactics and technologies to overcome superior adversaries. Their willingness to evolve and experiment, notably through the implementation of deep battle doctrine and combined arms operations, proved instrumental in turning the tide of the war. Effective leadership, whether in military or civilian contexts, requires more than authority or expertise. It demands humility, foresight, and the ability to inspire trust. The Red Army's evolution highlights the value of empowering subordinates, fostering collaboration, and remaining open to change. These principles remain relevant today, as organizations and communities navigate increasingly complex and dynamic environments. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Red Army's legacy is its focus on the human dimension of war. Behind every statistic and strategic decision lies a tapestry of individual stories of soldiers who fought valiantly, civilians who endured unimaginable suffering, and leaders who grappled with impossible choices. Figures like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Alexei Morisseyev, and Ivan Panfilov remind us that history is shaped not only by grand narratives, but also by the courage and sacrifices of ordinary people. Their heroism inspires admiration, but their struggles evoke empathy, challenging us to recognize the humanity in all those affected by conflict. At the same time, the darker chapters of the Red Army's history, the purges, the atrocities committed against civilians, and the suppression of dissent, serve as sobering reminders of the dangers of unchecked power and ideological extremism. They compel us to reflect on the ethical implications of our actions and the responsibilities that accompany authority. War, no matter how just its cause, leaves scars that transcend generations, and the decisions made in its name carry consequences that ripple through time. Finally, the Red Army's success underscores the power of unity amid diversity. Composed of soldiers from myriad ethnicities, backgrounds, and beliefs, the Red Army demonstrated that disparate groups could unite under a common banner to achieve extraordinary feats. This unity was not always harmonious. Tensions between nationalities and classes occasionally surfaced, but it was sustained by a shared commitment to a larger purpose. The integration of political commissars, engineers, partisans, and frontline troops illustrates the importance of leveraging diverse talents and perspectives to address complex challenges. In contemporary terms, this lesson speaks to the value of inclusivity and collaboration, whether in addressing global crises, fostering social cohesion, or driving innovation. The ability to harness diverse strengths while respecting individual differences remains a cornerstone of sustainable progress. The Red Army's story is one of contrasts, triumph and tragedy, heroism and horror, unity and division. It is a story that invites reflection, urging us to honor the sacrifices of the past while striving to build a better future. As we look back on the events of World War II, we are reminded of the fragility of peace and the resilience of the human spirit. The lessons of the Red Army, its achievements and its shortcomings, offer guidance for navigating the challenges of our own time, encouraging to lead with compassion, adapt with creativity, and persevere with hope. The legacy of the Red Army in World War II extends far beyond the battlefield, influencing global geopolitics in ways that continue to resonate today. Its triumphs and tribulations not only reshaped the borders of Europe and Asia, but also laid the groundwork for the ideological and strategic confrontations of the Cold War. Examining the Red Army's role in post-war reconstruction, its impact on international alliances, and its enduring influence on military doctrines, we can better understand how this formidable force helped define the modern world order. One of the most profound geopolitical consequences of the Red Army's advance into Eastern Europe was the establishment of what Winston Churchill famously termed the Iron Curtain. As Soviet forces liberated nations from Nazi occupation, they simultaneously installed communist-aligned governments, creating a buffer zone between the USSR and Western Europe. This division transformed the continent into two ideologically opposed blocs, setting the stage for decades of tension. In countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, the Red Army dismantled pre-war political structures and replaced them with regimes loyal to Moscow. Elections were often manipulated, dissent suppressed, and opposition leaders marginalized or exiled. While these actions were justified by Soviet leaders as necessary to prevent future invasions, they alienated many Europeans who viewed the Red Army less as liberators and more as occupiers. The imposition of Soviet-style socialism led to widespread resentment, fueling underground resistance movements and eventual uprisings such as the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and the Prague Spring of 1968. The division of Germany epitomized the broader fragmentation of Europe. Berlin, a city divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the Allies, became a microcosm of the East-West rivalry. The Soviet refusal to allow free elections in East Germany and the subsequent blockade of West Berlin in 1948-1949 underscored the growing divide. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961 under Soviet oversight, came to symbolize the physical and ideological barriers separating the capitalist West from the communist East. For nearly 3 decades, it stood as a stark reminder of the Red Army's role in shaping Europe's post-war landscape. The conclusion of World War II marked the end of the Grand Alliance between the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain, giving rise to the Cold War, a period defined by ideological competition and proxy conflict. The Red Army's dominance on the Eastern Front and its pivotal role in defeating Nazi Germany elevated the USSR to superpower status, challenging American hegemony. This newfound parity created an uneasy balance of power, characterized by mutual distrust and arms races. The presence of Soviet troops in Eastern Europe served as both a deterrent and a provocation. On one hand, it ensured compliance among satellite states and acted as a bulwark against perceived Western aggression. On the other hand, it heightened fears in Washington and London about Soviet expansionism, prompting the formation of NATO in 1949. The alliance, initially comprising 12 member states, was explicitly designed to counterbalance Soviet influence and provide collective security against potential Red Army incursions. Proxy wars emerged as a defining feature of the Cold War, with the Red Army indirectly involved through training, arming, and advising Allied forces. Conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and numerous African and Latin American nations bore the fingerprints of Soviet strategy, as Moscow sought to export communism and undermine Western interests. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation, highlighting the dangers posed by the militarization of ideological rivalries. Although direct confrontation between the Red Army and NATO forces was avoided, the specter of war loomed large, shaping diplomatic relations and defense policies worldwide. The Red Army's experiences during World War II profoundly influenced military doctrines across the globe. Its innovative use of combined arms operations, flexible logistics, and deception tactics set new standards for modern warfare. These strategies were studied and emulated by militaries seeking to prepare for large-scale conflicts in the nuclear age. The concept of deep battle, developed by Soviet theorists in the interwar period and refined during the conflict, inspired similar doctrines in other nations. Western powers, particularly the United States, incorporated elements of Soviet operational art into their own planning, emphasizing mobility, synchronization, and depth in combat operations. The emphasis on rapid mobilization and industrial capacity also informed Cold War-era strategies, as both sides prepared for prolonged conventional wars, supplemented by nuclear arsenals. Moreover, the Red Army's reliance on mass conscription and centralized command structures highlighted the importance of manpower and discipline in achieving strategic objectives. While some criticized these methods as outdated in an era of technological superiority, others recognized their effectiveness in specific contexts. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan 1979-1989, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated the adaptability of Red Army tactics in asymmetric warfare, even as it exposed vulnerabilities in counterinsurgency operations. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the Red Army as a unified force, dispersing its assets and personnel among newly independent republics. This dissolution prompted a re-evaluation of the Red Army's historical significance, as former adversaries and allies alike grappled with its complex legacy. In Russia, nostalgia, the Soviet era has fueled renewed interest in the Red Army's achievements, with Victory Day parades and memorials celebrating its role in defeating fascism. Internationally, the fall of the USSR altered global power dynamics, leaving the United States as the sole superpower. However, the lessons of the Red Army's campaigns, its strengths and weaknesses, continue to inform contemporary military thinking. Hybrid warfare, cyber operations, and information campaigns draw upon principles first articulated during World War II, underscoring the enduring relevance of Soviet innovations. Today, the shadow of the Red Army lingers in debates over sovereignty, security, and international cooperation. Nations once part of the Eastern Bloc remain wary of Russian intentions, particularly following events like the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and ongoing tensions in Ukraine. The memory of Soviet occupation influences public opinion and policy decisions, complicating efforts at reconciliation and integration within Europe. At the same time, the Red Army's contributions to defeating fascism are acknowledged as a shared achievement, fostering dialogue and understanding between former enemies. Collaborative projects, such as joint commemorations of World War II milestones, highlight the possibility of transcending past animosities. Yet, unresolved grievances and competing narratives ensure that the Red Army's legacy remains contested terrain. The Red Army's impact on modern geopolitics is undeniable. From the creation of the Iron Curtain to the dynamics of the Cold War, its actions shaped the contours of the 20th century and beyond. While its story is one of triumph and tragedy, heroism and horror, its lessons endure, offering insights into the complexities of power, ideology, and human nature. As we navigate the challenges of the present, the echoes of the Red Army remind us of the enduring consequences of choices made in times of crisis, and the responsibility to learn from history to forge a more peaceful future. The Red Army's role in World War II has left an indelible mark on global culture, shaping how the conflict is remembered and commemorated. Its victories and sacrifices have been immortalized in literature, film, art, and public memory, creating a rich tapestry of narratives that continue to influence perceptions of the war. Yet, these representations are not monolithic. They reflect diverse perspectives, ranging from glorification to critique, and reveal the complexities of how societies grapple with the legacy of one of history's most devastating conflicts. This chapter explores the cultural impact of the Red Army, examining its portrayal in media, its commemorative traditions, and the controversies surrounding its historical memory. The Red Army's triumphs during World War II became fertile ground for myth-making, particularly within the Soviet Union. Under Stalin and his successors, the state crafted a narrative of heroism and unity centered around the Great Patriotic War, a term used to emphasize the Soviet struggle against Nazi Germany as a uniquely righteous cause. This official story portrayed the Red Army as the savior of Europe, liberating millions from fascism while embodying the ideals of socialism. Propaganda posters, films, and literature celebrated soldiers as selfless defenders of the motherland, reinforcing the image of the USSR as a bastion of moral and military superiority. Key moments in the war were elevated to near mythical status. The defense of Moscow, the Battle of Stalingrad, and the fall of Berlin became touchstones of Soviet identity, symbolizing resilience, ingenuity, and ultimate victory. Figures like Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Sniper Lyudmila Pavyashenko, and the Panfilov's 28 Guardsmen were lionized as national heroes, their exploits retold in schools, museums, and popular culture. These narratives served both ideological and practical purposes, fostering patriotism and justifying the sacrifices demanded by the state. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, these heroic portrayals retained their appeal. In post-Soviet Russia, Victory Day parades and monuments to the Red Army remained central to national pride, evoking nostalgia for a time when the country stood as a global superpower. Films like Stalingrad 2013 and Panfilov's 28 Men 2016 perpetuate this tradition, blending historical events with cinematic spectacle to inspire contemporary audiences. While these works often prioritize drama over accuracy, they underscore the enduring power of the Red Army's mythos to captivate and unite. While official narratives emphasize triumph, artists and writers have long sought to capture the more nuanced realities of the Red Army's experience. During the war itself, Soviet authors like Mikhail Sholokhov and Konstantin Simonov chronicled the struggles of ordinary soldiers, highlighting themes of camaraderie, loss, and existential dread. Their works, such as Sholokov's The Science of Hatred and Simonov's Wait for Me, offered glimpses into the human cost of the conflict, resonating deeply with readers who had lived through the horrors of war. In the decades following the war, dissident voices emerged, challenging the sanitized versions propagated by the state. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Vasily Grossman exposed the darker aspects of the Soviet system, including the purges, censorship, and atrocities committed by the Red Army itself. Grossman's epic novel Life and Fate, banned in the USSR until the 1980s, juxtaposed the bravery of Soviet soldiers with the brutalities of totalitarianism, presenting a more complex and morally ambiguous view of the war. Outside the Soviet bloc, Western filmmakers and authors also engaged with the Red Army's story, often portraying it through the lens of Cold War tensions. Movies like Cross of Iron 1977, directed by Sam Peckinpah, depicted Soviet troops as both courageous warriors and victims of an oppressive regime. Similarly, novels like The Tin Drum by Günter Grass explored the devastation wrought by the Red Army's advance into Eastern Europe, reflecting German perspectives on liberation and occupation. These works contributed to a broader understanding of the war's multifaceted nature, acknowledging the Red Army's achievements while confronting its ethical ambiguities. The memory of the Red Army varies significantly across nations, shaped by differing experiences and interpretations of its actions during and after the war. In countries like Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, memories of Soviet liberation are often intertwined with resentment over subsequent occupation and repression. For many Poles, the Katyn massacre and the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising overshadow any gratitude for the defeat of Nazi Germany. Similarly, Ukrainians and Balts remember the Red Army not only as liberators but also as enforcers of Soviet domination, imposing communist rule and Russification policies that stifled national identities. Conversely, in nations like Belarus and Serbia, the Red Army is celebrated as a force of liberation and reconstruction. Belarusian historians emphasize the disproportionate losses suffered by their population during the war, crediting Soviet forces with delivering them from genocide. Serbian accounts highlight the Red Army's role in expelling Axis occupiers and supporting partisan movements, framing it as a partner in the fight against fascism. These contrasting narratives illustrate how local contexts shape collective memory, complicating efforts to arrive at a unified interpretation of the Red Army's legacy. The physical manifestations of the Red Army's cultural legacy, monuments, memorials, and museums are sites of both reverence and contention. Across the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, towering statues of Soviet soldiers stand as testaments to the Red Army's sacrifices. The most iconic example is the Motherland Calls monument in Volgograd, formerly Stalingrad, which dominates the skyline and serves as a pilgrimage site for those honoring the fallen. Similarly, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Moscow remains a focal point for national mourning and reflection. However, these symbols have become flashpoints in debates over historical memory. In countries like Estonia and Latvia, the removal of Soviet-era monuments has sparked protests and diplomatic disputes, reflecting ongoing tensions between pro-Western governments and ethnic Russian minorities. In Ukraine, the decommunization laws enacted after the Euromaidan Revolution led to the dismantling of thousands of statues and plaques commemorating Soviet figures, including Red Army commanders. Proponents argue that these measures are necessary to reclaim national identity, while critics accuse them of erasing history and alienating segments of the population. In Germany, the presence of Soviet war memorials raises similar questions about reconciliation and accountability. While some view these sites as reminders of the Red Army's role in defeating Nazism, others see them as relics of an oppressive era. The controversy surrounding the Treptower Park Memorial in Berlin exemplifies this tension, as discussions about its preservation intersect with debates about colonialism, racism, and historical justice. In the digital age, the Red Army's legacy has found new expression through video games, social media, and online communities. Titles like Company of Heroes 2 and Men of War allow players to simulate key battles from the Eastern Front, offering immersive experiences that blend entertainment with education. These games often strive for historical accuracy, though they inevitably simplify or dramatize events to enhance gameplay. Despite criticisms of bias or oversimplification, they introduce younger generations to the Red Army's story, sparking interest in its real-world counterpart. Social media platforms have also played a role in shaping perceptions of the Red Army, amplifying both celebratory and critical voices. Hashtags like Victory Day and Great Patriotic War trend annually on platforms like Twitter and Instagram, accompanied by images of parades, veterans, and family heirlooms. At the same time, hashtags like the Holodomor and Katyn Massacre draw attention to the darker chapters of Soviet history, fostering dialogue and debate among users worldwide. Online forums and subreddits dedicated to World War II provide spaces for enthusiasts to share research, discuss controversies, and challenge prevailing narratives, democratizing access to historical knowledge. The cultural legacy of the Red Army is neither static nor singular. It evolves alongside societal values, political climates, and technological advancements. Whether celebrated as a symbol of resistance and triumph or scrutinized for its flaws and excesses, the Red Army continues to occupy a central place in our collective imagination. Its story reminds us that history is not merely a record of facts, but a dynamic process of interpretation, shaped by those who tell it and those who hear it. As we engage with this legacy, through art, scholarship, or personal reflection, we contribute to an ongoing conversation about the meaning of sacrifice, the price of victory, and the lessons of the past.